Act 2. Settlement. Listen, noble children, for this is how our world began. 23 months in the warp they sailed, buffeted by storms of unreality, fearing demons, praying to the throne and the saints for deliverance. 7 months they lived on half rations. They exited the warp on St. Madrigal's Day, praying to blessed Madrigal and the God Emperor for safe harbour. And yea, before them was the planet, with its deep oceans and rich soil, an empty world, untouched by the hated Xenos, a planet clean, new, and empty, made safe and abundant for human habitation through the will of the most magnanimous God Emperor. In thanks to the saint, they christened it Madrigal's Deliverance. However, 67 years after settlement, the first settlers received an astropathic dispatch that this application for planetary christening had been denied, for 19 other settled worlds had already registered under variations of that name. But the first settlers were undaunted, for the planet was already known popularly by another name. They called the world Serenade, for it sang to them. Chronicles of the Settlement Serenade. Unknown author. Circa M33. Chapter 1. They are insects, but insects can sting. Humanity. A Tactical Treatise. Nemesaur Iontech. Solemnes. 7,036 years until next Astrarium opening. Trazyn stepped back to look at his work. After 2 centuries, it was nearly finished, at least as far as anything on Solemnes was finished. There were always new relics to acquire, anachronistic items and reproductions, stand-ins for artifacts or persons, to be replaced once the genuine specimen was found. But barring replacements and future renovations, the Horus Heresy Gallery was ready for visitors, at least if Trazyn decided to have any, once enough of his kind awoke to see his work, or awoke with minds intact enough to understand it. He'd left the largest display for last, and it was a masterpiece, larger than any other in the gallery. Istvan V had provided a rare opportunity to collect specimens. Regrettably unable to make the battle itself, even decades later there had been artifacts lying around unrecovered. Unusual for Astartes battlefields, but Istvan V had been unusual in many ways, including the number of space marines missing in action. Well, missing to the Imperium, not to Trazyn. He knew exactly where they were, knew the posture and pose of each soldier and the direction of their eyeline. Even now, he stepped into the display to adjust a ceramite-plated finger. The salamanders, after all, practice good weapons discipline. And Astartes like this one, with his back against a wall, shouting to his brothers to throw him another magazine, would not have a finger on the trigger. One small part in a tableau that measured 16 leagues square. But the details were so very important to communicating authenticity, particularly if one had to cut corners here and there. Trazyn was, after all, a practical being. If he became hung up on every piece being authentic, he would never finish anything. In general, Trazyn had not been much interested in humans. He collected them, of course. He collected everything. But he considered them on the same level as orcs, or various kinds of carnivorous algae. Their spread across the cosmos had destroyed so many more interesting civilizations, and since the rise of the Emperor, their culture had an utter sameness that bored him. If Trazyn cared about the mere ability to propagate and spread, he'd spend his eternity collecting bacteria. Just because a thing was successful and ubiquitous did not make it fascinating. It just made it common. But the heresy changed all that. Before, it was all colonization and settlement. This was history. This was drama. Betrayal, Struggle, brother fighting brother across the gulf of the stars. Empires rising and falling, heroes and rebels. He collected so much that he began to worry he'd gone overboard, especially since it hadn't stopped. Centuries out from the Siege of Terra, and he continued snatching up human artifacts wherever he could. Now, he not only had specimens, and spare specimens, but spares of spares. And this nomadic existence, these centuries of travel, also helped keep the Astrarium Mysterios secure. He didn't trust the security on Solemnes, even after tightening the protocols. Orokin had broken in before, but if Trazyn kept on the move, that seemed sufficient to foil Orokin's divinations. Or at least, he had not tried for the last millennium. A reprieve for which Trazyn was grateful. The heresy, after all, demanded his full attention. He even had plans to add a grand tableau of the Battle of Calth. Macragge was not far from Solemnes, giving him easy access to Ultramarines material, and perhaps even the confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Horus's body was likely being venerated somewhere in the Eye of Terror, after all, and the Emperor was just sitting there on Terra. Seemed a waste, such a historic figure left to rot like that. Trazyn could do a far better job at preservation and restoration. The humans probably wouldn't agree. He heard something move, stepped away from his diorama. "Sonnet!" He ran a systemic scry of the chamber. No signatures detected. A shadow darted between display plinths. The Hall of Armaments. Trazyn summoned his obliterator and walked through the wide doorway of the hall. Plinths rose like a stubby forest, stasis fields glowing off-white in his enhanced oculars. "Sonnet," he said. "Identify." Nothing. He sidled his back against a plinth containing a long frost blade, Fenris pattern. Its beaten edge nicked and scratched. Hard to classify, that sword. The hilt was Crusade era, decorated with kraken teeth, but the blade itself dated from much earlier. Another image flitted between plinths. This time, Trazyn caught the comet blur of its energy trail. "Come out, coward!" Trazyn growled. The hands came through the plinth behind him, the cascading power that blazed from each fingertip tickling him with thread-thin bursts of lightning before they grabbed him and pinned him down. His arms went numb at the touch. He dropped his empathic obliterator. A blast of energy sent it barreling across the gallery. Trazyn heard it clank to the floor far off, in darkness. A head materialized through the plinth, twisting around so its jagged mouth spoke directly to his ear.
"Hail, Trazyn of Solemnes,"
said Orokin, the diviner, his words crackling and hissing like a severed power cable.
"I see you have been playing with your toys. A nice display. Shall I leave it intact? Give me what I wish, and it shall be done."
Trazyn felt the blazing hand drop to his waist and open his dimensional pocket. It drew out the Mysterios, yellow sparks spitting from where it contacted the black metal. "I'll only take it back, you know," Trazyn responded. "It will be a merry chase."
"I think not. You see, I have cast the Zodiac on every permutation of—"
Trazyn's hand plunged into the stasis field, gripping the Fenrisian blade just above the tip. It cut his fingers, but pain was nothing to him. He ripped it from the howling field and raked the tip across the diviner's pulsating face. Orokin howled, snapped backward through the pillar. The Mysterios, unable to travel through solid metal, fell to the black stone floor. Trazyn wheeled, holding the ancient weapon in two hands, feeling its power thrum through him. An ordinary blade would not have harmed an energy being, but Trazyn did not collect ordinary things. A flash. Orokin streaked at him, a lightning strike given form, arcane gales howling about him. His star-shaped staff sliced an arc that threatened to bisect Trazyn at the middle. Trazyn parried with the ancient blade, watching it absorb the crackling electricity of the blow, then swept it upward to rip through the energy ghost. It met resistance, as if the thing he struck were made of flesh and bone, rather than an animate storm. Orokin howled and retreated, disappearing into a pillar. Trazyn spun, trying to cover every angle. He consulted the Time-Splinter Cloak's possibility matrix.
"I will burn your oculars," the voice echoed. "I have sworn the blood feud."
"Then come do it," said Trazyn. A crackle from the Istvan display. Trazyn set his footing to meet the charge and brought his guard high for a killing strike. The blazing sparks leapt towards him, plinth to plinth, running through the power systems like a fuse burning towards an explosive. Each plinth he passed fizzled and sparked, stasis fields blowing out. Priceless relics tumbled to the Blackstone, their repulsor fields shorting. An entire rack of Astartes helmets, nearly one from each legion, crashed in a heap and rolled across the floor. Trazyn tensed, calculating the timing of his strike. The blade would have one last victim. And, in his peripheral senses, he saw the glowing hands come up through the floor, saw them seize the Mysterios and disappear into a dimensional pocket. And all that remained of Orokin was his mocking laughter. Serenade. 5,821 years until next Astrarium opening. Orokin had not experienced hunger in so long, but he was ravenous. Planetary alignment was the key. The stars needed to be right. Star positioning and cosmic alignment, the lines of the universe collecting and directing power in a way that he could channel it through himself, if only briefly. The first time it happened on Serenade— no, he reminded himself, that was the human name. It was called Sephiroth then. The experience had taken him by surprise. Only a few seconds of escaping the physical, of unleashing what Orokin now considered his true form. Indeed, it had frightened him. And that his first reaction to this liberation was fear told him more about the prison of his body than he'd learned from whole libraries of study. How deeply had the Catan warped them that he was afraid to let go of this constricting, rigid form. How terrible and joyous it was to once again have a soul. After he'd climbed out of that saurian body cavity, reborn and slicked in blood, all he'd wanted was for it to happen again. 3 centuries he tried without success. He had time, though. Internal auguries told him that transcendence was the key to recapturing the Mysterios. Master the transmutation of the energy form, and he would master the physical barrier of Trazyn. Study, meditation, experimentation, trance. He cast zodiacs and chronoscopes, tracked the celestial bodies, ran permutations and simulations where he moved the constellations like gears, with Sephiroth or Mandragora as the center. Vega rising in the domicile of Thusela the Cryptek, Castep the Pharaon in opposition to the Hydra's teeth, the Master Star, Riga, transiting the 11th house in retrograde. And he marked the dates and locations when the stars would be right. During the first alignment he'd failed. His absorption aura broke down under the radioactive assault of the cosmic rays. 2.5 centuries more study, more waiting. He'd held the energy form for over a minute on the second attempt. Like those air molecules before the ghost arc, his atoms superheated until they broke down into pure energy and heat and remained incandescent until he lost control and re-solidified. Transmutation was not like being an astral program. During that trance operation, he projected his astral algorithm out into space, his consciousness floating free from his own body. When he transmuted, his body became energy, and the stronger the power surge, the greater his power. And with the right celestial alignment, he would become very powerful indeed. But finding the right time and place required precise calculation, planning, and patience. The infiltration on Solemnes had been only a moderate alignment, one that had turned him to a ghost, not a god. but it was perfectly timed for a raid. The auguries were good. Divination charts predicted success. And now he had the Mysterios, and was unlocking its secrets. The cool blue sphere of Serenade floated outside the observatory window of his personal craft, Zodiac's Fury. One section on the largest continent, he noticed, stood out brown-black like a tumour. It was the size of his thumb, if he extended his hand, and dirty smoke came from it, wrapping the planet like a foul girdle. Pity. But it would not hurt anything of consequence. Organic life was such a temporary thing. Inside the meditation chamber, the Mysterios floated in alignment with the planet. Orokin felt the device worked better here. Indeed, it seemed to want to be here. Was it eccentric, he asked himself, to ascribe wants and needs to an inanimate object? Orokin thought not. By certain measures, a scarab was inanimate. So was a tomb wraith, a human cogitator, a string instrument, yet they all had needs, optimal operating environments. Or maybe, just maybe, it was more than that. Orokin approached the device, adjusting the gravitational signature to match Serenade, dialed up the temperature and humidity to match the surface, to fool it into thinking it did not sit in the dry chill of a Necron vessel. The surface was risky. Humans had infested the planet, as they will. Too many eyes. He had not been down in centuries, apart from short expeditionary studies. Orbit, however, was another matter. Here he could study the Mysterios in safety. Cool metal and angles, vertices and glyphs. Could such perfection ever be mindless? Orokin suspected not. During his centuries, he dissected and reverse-engineered many machines, and knew that you could not study a technology without, in some way, connecting with the mind of its creator. Devices were an expression of their maker's mind as much as any song or poem, and he had come to know Vishani. But he had never seen her until this moment. The first time she came to him, it was in his meditations. This was not unusual. A cryptek's mind was a deep thing, and it was easy to inadvertently create thought forms resembling old masters or colleagues. Indeed, Orokin had engaged in deep discourses with those long dead, or rather had held great conversations with his engrammatic impressions of them. A good cryptek knew to be wary of such things. Let them run free, and fantasy could take over from simulation, a hard master lavishing you with praise, debate opponents giving in to arguments too easily, admitting their stupidities and naming you their better. And, of course, it could mean that one was going mad. So when Vishani came, Orokin was both delighted and sceptical. He kept her at arm's length. At first she was a mere echo, couplets from her algorithmic poetry repeating in his mind, data points from her treatise running, unprompted, through Orokin's logic processor. Then, one day, she spoke. One word. No. He'd stopped mid-calculation, reviewed his logic chain and discovered an error, a single angle of the Mysterios, encoded in his algorithm as obtuse rather than accurate. A major error that would have queered his star chart and fouled decades of calculations. Had he sensed her, hovering at the very edge of his perception suite? Not a physical form, there was nothing to see, but a presence. As he continued his centuries of work, the thought form would occasionally make itself known, suggesting, nudging. Orokin was not so absurd to think it was really Vishani, merely a subconscious logic routine projecting itself as external, providing a guide and sounding board, taking on a voice he respected, and Orokin respected so few voices. They pleased him, these visitations. Whatever this logic routine was, and it must be buried deep, since he could not find or isolate it, it had rare insight into the device's operation. Perhaps the portion of his engrams building a dataset on Vishani had even gained low-level sentience, at the level of a canoptic wraith. Or, and his senses prickled at this thought, perhaps Vishani had inserted a portion of her own personality algorithm into the device, and he'd acquired it over the centuries. He had certainly opened his own neural network to it when casting Ralag's grid of investigation, which might explain why, in the dead god's name, she was standing behind his right shoulder now. He moved his head slowly, ocular ratcheted to maximum in case she dissolved when he looked directly at her. If it was a manifestation of his own consciousness, it was a strange one, since Orokin had no basis for reconstructing what Vashani would have looked like. If Orokin had breath, it would have caught. Such handiwork. Vashani's body was modified, efficient, a masterwork of astro-engineering, reshaped in a bizarre way, almost as radically as a destroyer. But while those abominations rebuilt their bodies with the single-minded goal to exterminate, Vashani had reconfigured herself to acquire and analyze. She was a palace, built of knowledge. The Datamancer had a long cranium, capped by a many-cabled headdress, its cylinders hanging in a perfect box around her monocular, in the front. In the back, they trailed long to plug into the databank behind. And that databank was what was so striking. Her legs had been removed entirely, her torso installed into a great lobster-like tail that racked engram blades and logic tablets. 10 crustacean-like legs bore the weight of the extra capacity. Then, just as he was able to make her out, she spoke.
"He's here."
Orokin's ocular snapped open. He dropped from his hovering trance position to the deck, one hand forming a low hunched tripod. Nothing moved. The Mysterios rotated silently in the air. Dozens of cryptechs knelt in a pentagram pattern, the 5-sided formation matching each flat face of the 12-sided Mysterios. Hands crossed over their chests, heads down, murmuring esoteric code. So many minds, Orokin realized, for Trazyn to infiltrate. He stepped forward, scrying the group with his ocular and sensor suite, quietly twisting his left hand to cast a hex algorithm that would jump from cryptech to cryptech, scouring their neural networks for intrusion. One cryptech was out of step, hesitating, speaking the data chain as if, instead of it running through his processing node, he were reading it from the surface thoughts of another. Orokin passed him, staring into the oculars of the cryptech next to him, cocking his head, sending out a visible scry beam, as if inspecting its data flow. Fast as a viper, he grasped the tardy cryptech's throat, lifted him up into the air. Caring not about striking a blow with his staff, he manifested the weapon with the haft, phasing into reality halfway through the hanging Necron's vitals.
"Inept as ever, Trazyn,"
he cackled, twisting the staff to provoke deeper systemic damage.
"Your puerile games of dress-up are unconvincing at the best of times, but thinking you could mimic one initiated into the technomantic mysteries was arrogant even by your high standard. A being cannot impersonate what it cannot understand."
"No," said Trazyn. "That's why I used a decoy." He was standing by the observatory window, the Mysterios in his hand. He tossed and caught it once, then winked and levelled the other hand towards Orokin as if it were a pistol. For a moment, that's what it appeared to be, merely an insulting gesture, one finger out, thumb cocked like a hammer. Then, Orokin saw the detonator. Behind Trazyn, an implosive scarab scampered up the crystal field and clamped to the surface, rune indicators green. The haughty bastard was going to blow himself into space, the fastest exit. Orokin dialed back his chronosense, slowed time to a near stop, saw the long thumb descending. He did not throw the Staff of Tomorrow. Nothing thrown could achieve the velocities the staff did, as it sailed headpiece first across the meditation chamber. Had it happened on the planet below, it would have broken the sonic barrier, sending an echoing crack across the entire chamber. But there was no atmosphere on a Necron tomb ship to compress. 10,000 souls aboard, and not one had lungs. Instead, it merely streaked across the chamber, straight and fast as a lasbolt. It passed 17 microns above the trigger button and severed Trazen's thumb, the disconnected digit spinning upward as the staff continued into the archivist's chest cavity, shattering the Nihilak Ankh on his sternum. Metal ribs, tinted royal aquamarine, tore and parted before the glowing emerald of the staff's headpiece. Vital systems smashed, and reactor fluid sizzled on the weapon's ultra-cold power field. Trazen folded, the blade striking his spine and snapping him further into his eternal hunch. The archivist fell to his knees, hands opening to spill the detonator and Mysterios. Orokin scooped up the Mysterios with one hand and grabbed the staff with the other, driving it deep into his rival. He would start to phase at any time, reforged on Solemnes or hopping to one of those damn surrogates of his. Before that happened, Orokin wanted him to feel every moment of his humiliation. He sent a pulse of pure time-space through the staff, slowing the injuries, making Trazen feel it.
"You are a poor guest, Trazen," he wheedled. "Not much has changed, I see. Whenever you dined at the palace, I always told the Pharaoh to count the dinnerware afterwards."
"But, Trazen struggled to talk. Reactor fluid, boiling yellow, was leaking from between his steel teeth. "I got gassed." His voice dissolved in a hack purge routine.
"A good guest."
Orokin twisted the staff deeper to halt any repair protocols.
"No, a good guest brings good conversation, and you are so quiet now, Trazen. Why ever would that be?"
"Good guests," said Trazen, smiling. "Bring gifts." Then he phased, spots of incandescent jade light breaking out on him like sores. Sores that unmade him, widening to reveal nothing inside their expanding borders but the crystal window and decking behind. In an instant, he was gone, back to a new body. "Gifts?" said Orokin. He crouched over the Mysterios, examining its sides, measuring it. It was wrong. Trazen had destabilized it. The glyphs were all a match, the angles and faces correct, but it was missing a vibration, that sense of confluence. One of the sides sprung open, an intricate hatchway that Orokin had never seen spilled prismatic light. He leaned to look into it. They were on him immediately, writhing and biting, legs scouring trenches in his armored body, mandibles digging deep into the living metal of his head and arms. He tried to beat them away, but they snapped and swallowed his fingers. Orokin said the word of Pharos, blue flame leaping from his body, and finally the creatures retreated to the shadows, scrabbling into ducts and scarab hatches. Sparking, wounded, Orokin looked into what he'd thought was the Mysterios, a disguised tesseract vault, the kind Trazen used for his samples, and next to it a necrodermis sheet letter that had ejected from the device, along with the creatures. It bore the marks of alien mandibles, but was still legible. "Greetings, Orokin," it began. "I apologize for having to borrow back my astrarium. I know how deeply you appreciate it, but you work too hard, my astromancer. Consider this a relaxing break. And what is more relaxing than a hunt?" Orokin heard legs scraping in the scarab vents. Interstitial messages alerted him that a scarab swarm and 2 wraiths were reporting in as inoperable. "These creatures will make a fine quarry. They're from an imperial jungle planet, and so famous that the locals named their local regiment after them. Highly venomous. Not that it would bother you, dear colleague, and can grow to over 15 foot long when they reach maturity. But the real challenge is how quick they breed. In fact, if you want my advice, I would start the pursuit quickly. 14 juveniles were in this particular gift. Or was it 16? Oh. Anyway, within 12 hours the population will have established roving kin groups to place their eggs. Oh, did I forget to mention the eggs? Half of the breeding pairs already have sacs. The population will double in less than 24 hours, provided they don't eat too many of the young. Happy hunting! Serenade, 2007 years until next Astrarium opening. Trazyn did not like hunting Necrons. He was no stranger to dynastic wars. Before biotransference, the dynasties had fought each other in vicious succession wars and blood feuds. His culture built whole rituals, religious and civil, prescribing the proper method of waging war against one's own kind, and Trazyn had been on the gory fields of those battles, as an observer, not a combatant, but still. And there were some of his kind Trazyn would gladly kill. A certain astrology-addled, plate-faced stargazer, for example. Yet this was different. This was extermination. The Eldari had vanished. Slain or fled, Trazyn did not know, but he suspected both. Their world spirit destroyed, they would have had cause to run, and on arrival his orbital scryers had detected the ruined structure of a webway portal, constructed from immense saurian bones. Orokin had, in a way, been right. The Exodites had lived here, but it was not their home world. They were refugees, fleeing a thirsting god, and finding this planet no longer safe, they'd struck camp and moved on. The humans he'd captured, merely for interrogation, not acquisition, had little idea that the Eldari had ever been there. Clad in feather cloaks and imperial body gloves, they told Trazyn fantastical stories about a primordial past, when the Emperor and his angels had called this world home. The Emperor himself had called the great structures from the earth, growing them from the planet itself. They look strange, yes, but many things from that otherworldly age will look strange to us now. And so they set statues of imperial saints in the niches of Eldari houses and weather vanes, believing them temples raised by the withered god-king of terror. Their manuscripts, while rare, showed an altered calligraphic style that was decidedly rune-like, no doubt copied from what script remained on the buildings. Once, Trazyn had seen a chapel of St. Eustace of the Void, outfitted in a scallop shell outbuilding. Imperial symbols epoxied over the doorways because the settlers' nails could not penetrate the bone. The building, Trazyn realized, had been a sewage processing station. But these stories, the odd feather cloaks and the deviant calligraphic script, were not his concern. He wanted to know about the Metal Men. Orokin had unleashed 112 destroyers. Why that number, Trazyn did not know, but he assumed it was some numerological nonsense that no doubt the diviner found extremely significant. Trazyn had seen evidence of them on his previous site surveys. He liked to check in briefly on Sephiril, or Serenade, whatever they called it, to take readings in preparation for the opening. Have his angles covered. His return visit to the previous opening location was disheartening in the extreme. It was barren rock, scoured of life down to its volcanic soil. Destroyers started with the apex predators and worked their way down. The Eldari first, then the Saurians, then the large carnivores. Anything below that was no threat to them, so they switched to the bottom of the food chain, clear-cut the plant life, vaporizing trees and ground-covering plants with great fan arcs from their Gauss blasters, boiled the lakes and streams so no fresh water remained. They were mathematically thorough, ensuring no habitat or food source remained for the insects. Once the insects disappeared, the small amphibians and reptiles went within a few years, growing skeletal and desperate, until their leathery skins lay on the bare earth, a sad bag for brittle bones. These, too, the destroyers atomized, because they knew that death could bring new life. Indeed, it had taken them several decades to sterilize that first island. Since the 21 destroyers remaining, many fell in combat with the Eldari or the Great Saurians, frequently had to double back and eradicate regrowth. It was their thoroughness, Trazyn reflected, that had kept them from scouring the whole planet. They killed all organisms down to the microbes before moving on, and life was tenacious in this verdant archipelago. The geography, too, worked against them. On a great continent, their tactics could easily lead to a wide-scale environmental collapse, the effects radiating outward as species migrated and fires spread. On an island, the damage was contained. But 4,500 years was a long time, even to a Necron, and in that time the destroyers had migrated along the archipelago, heading southwest towards the mega-continent that covered the other hemisphere. Over 3 millennia, they'd scoured 2,000 of the archipelago's 10,000 islands clean. Most were uninhabited by sentient life, and what habitants they had, Eldari, then human, did occasionally take one down. There were only 12 remaining when they reached the mainland, and the true slaughter began. The megacontinent was in environmental collapse. Indeed, most humans had chosen to settle on the islands, the seat of imperial power, such as it was, partially due to the rumours of evil creatures living on the mainland. This was a frontier continent on a frontier world, wild and untamed. Or what was left of it. The saurians were gone. Smaller specimens remained, but the ecosystem could no longer support such large creatures. Trazyn looked up to see the sun, filtered through the veil of smoke that wreathed the world. It was from burning rainforest. He tracked them for 6 years. Difficult, since the volcanic soil befouled his senses. Objects under the surface could not be detected at all, and he suspected that it was not just the vast gulfs of space that made translations difficult on Serenade. Transportations had to be done by night scythe, ghost arc, or on foot. His few survey explorations into the cave system suggested that if a Necron died beneath the surface, they could not be phased back to the tomb worlds for repair. He'd been chasing a nomad story about evil spirits when he found them. There were 3 of them, at least fully operative. A 4th Trazyn had found 100 leagues behind, his repulsor array torn from his body in a long-ago battle. Still, he pulled his legless form across the scorched dirt, blasting insects to ash with his malfunctioning Gauss cannon, pulverizing worms with his deathless hands. Trazyn had decapitated the destroyer with a single disgusted blow from his obliterator, then continued hammering. He thought about the feather cloak he'd brought back from his first visit to this planet, how it shimmered with cerulean, turquoise, gold and vermilion when he adjusted the light. He thought about what the birds who produced such feathers, birds he'd wanted to collect in a frozen aviary, would have looked like in a display. As he travelled this continent, the cloaks had got shorter and shorter. Siblings cannibalized their parents' cloaks to make their own because the birds now only existed in the high mountains. Trazyn tossed the head of the decapitated destroyer at the remaining trio. It bounced off the thorax carapace of the leader and came to rest in front of them, viridian smoke still leaking from its mouth. Their Gauss cannons, dripping neon condensate from overuse, stopped firing. They pivoted.
"Hail," said Trazyn. "To whom do I speak?"
The destroyers buzzed and crackled, their vocal actuators trying to remember how to form words.
"I am Lord Kertva of the Locust,"
said the one in the centre.
"You have slain one of my servants."
"Yes."
"Good. He was inefficient, suboptimal. He no longer embodied the ideal of annihilation. All life must end, including ours. To cease to exist is the happy fate of all who served the Great Scouring."
"Then I have good news," Trazyn said, unable to conceal his distaste. "Your happy fate has come. By my protocol rights as Overlord, I hereby release you from your mission programming. Come with me, and I will repurpose you. There are tasks for you on Solemnis."
"Negative,"
responded Ketvar.
"Our mission is incomplete. We are working our way south to the pole. Once melted, The resulting influx of fresh water will desalinate the oceans, killing the phytoplankton that manufacture the majority of this world's oxygen. The resulting mass extinction will allow us to scour this world in 2 millennia rather than 6. We will leave any Necron structures untouched. As we agreed with the Astromancer, you may do with those what you will.
No, said Trazyn. I think not.
Why?
Because there are still things here that I want, Trazyn answered, and tossed the Tesseract labyrinth. The destroyers surged forward, repulsors humming, spinning up to a howl. Gauss blasters spewed jade thunderbolts. They crawled through the air, dancing within the ropey tube field of their disassembly beams. Trazyn activated the cloak, chose his path, ducked and threw himself aside as the earth where he was standing vanished, puffed into a cloud of ash shavings. He wormed between the beams, summoned the Obliterator, and lit its great lantern-like emitter chamber so it glowed with sinister light. The destroyers stalled. Murderous, nihilistic killers though they were, the glow of this ancient weapon still overwhelmed their neural threat networks with a thing that was very much like dread. Trazyn activated the Tesseract labyrinth. A cone of light spilled upward, engulfing the destroyers, bathing their dented faces in illumination so bright it washed out their colours, so they appeared as grimacing skeletons sketched in black and white. And like the disassembly beams of their Gauss weapons, it took them apart, drawing them into the box. Trazyn was alone in the scoured field. He stayed until sunset, watching the fires on the forest canopy until they died into whispering smoke. A fine addition to the collection, he thought. The Destroyer Lord, who nearly wiped out a planet. When he returned, chaos ruled on Solemnes. After 4,500 years of rivalry, it was clear Trazyn had needed a new security solution. The Mysterious was not safe in Trazyn's possession, nor was it secure when housed in its proper gallery. But the prismatic galleries were a vast, confusing place, winding sepulchral corridors, objects from every major alien species rammed cheek by jowl, time periods intermixed, billion-year-old relics held next to recent acquisitions, galleries that held life-size dioramas of entire battlefields with thousands of troops frozen in mortal struggle. Even Trazyn found it difficult to recall exactly what it contained. His rack of Adeptus Astartes helmets had grown so large and convoluted that he needed mnemonic charts to sort the Firehawks from the Flame Eagles. The mix of time periods, Trazyn knew, fouled Orokin's abilities, a fact he'd exploited for the last few millennia by stashing the Astrarium Mysterios at random locations in his collection. Orokin had broken in, of course, but he usually didn't cause much damage, staying stealthy, Trazyn supposed. He moved it on occasion to keep things interesting, but, in retrospect, it was probably a mistake putting it in the Angelus display. Deep-ridged tires tore at the chalky earth, sending up twin plumes of dust that spread out from the Orc truck like a wake. It slewed sideways, drifting, 2 wheels leaving the ground as if it might go over. Then it slammed down on the bouncing suspension and clawed towards Trazyn. Stasis field failure. That meant one thing. The idiot had finally found the Mysterios, meaning the Orcs were loose and doing what Orcs did in their natural state, which was fight each other. Trucks and buggies howled corkscrews across the display, ripping across the desert shantytown built around the enormous idol of Gork or Mork. Trazyn's investigation had turned up mixed answers on exactly whom it represented. The truck bore down on him, and Trazyn swept the Obliterator back, calculating his strike. The knob riding in the back planted his foot on the driver's seat for balance and extended a crude slugger, taking what counted for Orcs as aim. The driver, his seat shoved forward by the knob's boot, drove with his massive goggles only a hair above the steering wheel.
"Ray! Silent Git!
The Nob bellowed and emptied his magazine. Bullets, the size of human tongues and about as dangerous, whistled past Trazyn. One clanged off his forehead. This Nob was clearly a marksman. Trazyn slammed the ground ahead of the truck, denting the earth in a pothole wide as a battle tank. Cracks jagged out towards the oncoming tyres. The truck nosed down and pitched forward, the Nob howling in delight as he went suddenly airborne. Those inside who had unwisely held on wailed in sudden fear as the truck flipped forward, crushing them into green fungal paste. A dazed Grot, miraculously unharmed, staggered from the wreck. Trazyn kicked it into the spikes of a still-rotating tyre.
Bring it in,
he shouted. The Catacomb command barge sailed above the motorized brawl, its two hard-wired pilots head down at their consoles, heedless of the anarchy beneath them. Trazyn cut his way towards it, scattering a horde of Gretchen who came at him, waving a tattered red flag. Vile little hands grasped at his cloak. Yellow teeth, set in receding gums, gnawed his shins and thighs.
Nuisance! Nuisance! Nuisance!
He shouted, stomping them beneath his feet, shaking the last clinging Grot from his leg and leaping onto his command dais. The crescent shape of the command barge rose, slugger and shooter rounds pinging off its armoured underside. In the distance, across the golden dunes, Trazyn could see the upturned wreck of a starship. Mounted outriders weaved along the crests of the sand dunes, spindly jez sails savaging the motorized orcs with harassing fire. One of his larger displays, one of his better displays. It had taken him nearly 50 years to capture the eternal chaos of this place, to choreograph the hacking melees and hairpin turns, wiry juveniles leaping between speeding vehicles. He hoped some of it could be salvaged. The command barge shot upward along the swollen belly of the great idol. Shots pinged out of the idol's interior, puncturing its patchwork skin, and Trazyn realized the fighting had reached inside it.
Best stop this, he thought. Sanet? Working to restore stasis fields, High Archivist,
came the interstitial reply.
Work faster. We don't want them turning this contraption on. Do you think the engine works? Sanet replied. Engines, corrected Trazyn. There are around 70, depending on one's definition of engine. Get those fields up, Sanet. I don't want to be in orbit.
Bolts along the side of the idol blew. A gantry fell away, and the command barge made a sickening dip to avoid being struck from the sky.
Authenticity be damned, thought Trazyn. Next time I acquire a rocket, I am displaying it without fuel.
Then he saw it, a figure standing in the idol's left eye, the place where he, perhaps a bit too cleverly, had hidden the Astrarium Mysterios. His oculars enhanced the image, scrubbed out the interference. He already knew what he would find. Orokin, his necrodermis scratched and dinged from his fighting ascent up the interior of the idol. Clearly things had not gone precisely to plan for him either. In one hand he held the Astrarium Mysterios, its metal skin glowing as if pleased by the reversal. Orokin stabbed his staff downward, and another gantry blew its bolts and fell away, unnaturally toppling towards the barge. Trazyn threw a stasis field, halting it in the air until they passed, then let it go, watched it crush a shantytown district he designed room by room. Above him, and through the roar of growling rocket boosters, he could hear Orokin laughing. Trazyn looked up at him again. He could feel his central reactor cycling hard in fury, as if it might burst. Restoration calculations returned a work estimate that fluctuated just under 1 million man-hours. A century of effort wasted. And if the idle rocket took off, it would be triple that. Trazyn felt wetness on his cheeks, and realized he was weeping oil.
Lord,
it was Sanet.
20 seconds to lift-off.
Trazyn knew why Orokin laughed. Trazyn could either save the Mysterios or the gallery, and they both knew which he would pick. He grabbed his override control orb and redirected the barge, sweeping it around to the side where one of the gantries had separated, pulled it up to a closed hatch. 15 seconds. Trazyn ripped the hatch open with his bare hands, the metal frame bending like pressed tin under his enraged grip, set it aside to reattach later. 11 seconds. He summoned the obliterator. The chamber inside was nothing like any spacecraft Trazyn was used to. A drum-like deck filled with crude tables and chairs, random machinery hanging from the ceiling, barrels of fungus beer slopping with the reverberation of the misfiring engines, and a command throne with 2 buttons: go and stop. A hulking orc sliced at him with a cleaver-like chopper, and he crushed its meaty chest with a swing of the obliterator. Then he reversed, stabbing the staff through a wiry greenskin skull as it approached his blind side. 8 seconds. He cut through the crowd. Reaching hands grasped him to pull him down, and he sent a jolt of crawling electricity through his systems to shake them off. 6 seconds. The room shook. A mech boy loomed from the shadows, electrodes crackling from the mad machinery that sprouted from his back and shoulders. A localized storm flashed around the balls of ionized gas that whirled above his head like a turbine. Ball lightning leapt from the muzzle of his fluted electrogun, and Trazyn staggered, circuitry system fizzing with overload. He doubled over, the world turning ashen and out of focus like a bad projection. Then he redirected the energy bolt, threw his staff, and blew the mech boy back, his muscles in spasm and harnessed apparatus spinning out of control. 4 seconds. He stepped up to the control throne, and the mega knob sitting in it rose to meet him. The thing was huge. Trazyn had installed it himself, picking the biggest, meanest specimen he could find. The slab-like mega armor, thick as a tank glacis, seemed impenetrable. Great curved horns rose from his skullcap. He roared, a low, guttural sound that burst from his purple throat with almost physical force. Termite squigs tunneled in his gold-capped fangs. 3 seconds. The power claw caught Trazyn's arm as he brought the obliterator down, bending his humerus the wrong way. Metal rended. Hydraulics popped. Reactor fluid spurted from Trazyn's severed arm as howling alerts filled his vision. 2 seconds. Trazyn turned his spurting arm towards the beast's face, and it bellowed as the gushing neon fluid burned out its eyes. 1. Trazyn seized the beast by a horn and slammed its face down on the stop button. Then, exhausted and surrounded by the howls of the barbarian orcs, he slowed his chronosense and collapsed into the command chair. It was, he told himself, only for a moment, but he had to collect himself if he was to fight his way out. With time slowed, and the world moving as if underwater, it took Trazyn a moment to realize what was happening. These orcs were not shouting war cries or preparing to rush the throne. They were howling, cheering, enthralled by the spectacle of violence he demonstrated for them. They were still cheering when the stasis field locked them in place. Trazyn slumped in the chair, trying to imagine what he could salvage from the display. Not his pride, he decided. Mandragora. 897 years until next Astrarium opening. Orokin had just turned the corner when he saw the Deathmark step out of the hyperspace oubliette. Its long, deadly form slid from the pocket dimension where it had waited for him dead gods knew how long. It leveled a long synaptic disintegrator, the glow from the viridian bulbs lighting the one-eyed killer's face as its death mask ran like wax and solidified into Trazyn's features. "Really, Trazyn," the diviner sniffed, "have you sunk to base as—" The disintegrator shot punched through Orokin's big central ocular, its balefile howling through his cranial structure like a sandstorm through a ruined temple. Emerald flames burst from his mouth. His shattered ocular ringed his head like a crown. His necrodermis blackened. Orokin dropped, hands clawing, fingers starting to phase, eaten by glowworms of portal light. His charred skull crunched as he spoke.
I don't have the mysterious...
You can keep it, said Trazyn, stepping back into the hyperspace oubliette. Chapter 2.
I'm telling you, lads, there's nothing better than scrapping. With those shiny things with the scully faces, they so frightening, and you gets to kill the same ones over and over. Ever tried that with humans? Not as fun.
Boss Doc Bigsaw. Wah Bigsaw. 50 years until next Astrarium opening. Turning endlessly in the eternal night, frozen and bereft. That was Klebnos, a drifting asteroid of interest to no one. A being could walk its prime meridian in 2 hours. It only carried a name because on the crown world of Geddon you could see it transit with the naked eye, making it, to the ancient Necrontyr at least, worthy of being anointed with language. Its utter unimportance, while technically being under the protection of the Nahailak dynasty, was in fact why Trazyn had picked it for the meeting. Neutral ground in a technical sense, but any aggression could precipitate a dynastic war. Of course, the last time Trazyn had met Orokin 8 centuries ago, he had blown open the Chronomancer's cranium. Orokin and his entourage of canoptic wraiths were already standing on the small asteroid when Trazyn arrived, his personal night scythe dropping low to disgorge him and his Lychguard escorts through its underside portal. It hovered there, active, ready to depart within seconds. The two sides came within speaking distance and stopped, scrying each other. Out in the dark, contrails formed as doom scythes circled, ready to mark targets and annihilate the rival delegation at the slightest hint of violence.
I suggest, Trazyn began, you start by turning over what you promised.
Orokin nodded, opened a dimensional pocket, and stretched out his hand. The Astrarium Mysterios drifted weightless, tracing a soft parabola between the rivals.
Catch it,
Trazyn ordered a Lychguard.
In case it's a vortex bomb.
The soldier obediently stepped out and let the black metal object descend into his upturned palms. It did not explode, and a thorough spectromantic bombardment assured Trazyn it was genuine.
Your part of the bargain is done, said Trazyn. So, I will fulfill mine in kind. You have 5 minutes to explain what's so almighty important.
Orokin took a step forward. He appeared, Trazyn thought, to be in a bad way. Scratches raked across his unpolished necrodermis. His ocular and orb crest appeared dim and fatigued, as if he'd worked long hours without maintenance or refurbishment.
An orc invasion has come to Sephril, or rather, Serenade, the tomb complex of Sephris.
And you care about a few greenskins wrecking the place, do you? Trazyn sneered. You are, let us remember, the being who caused a mass extinction by utilizing troops with the Destroyer madness.
That was different,
Orokin said, waving a dismissive hand.
Species come and go, civilizations rise and fall. I've always known you were mired in the past, Trazyn, but in the last few millennia you've developed a fetishistic attachment to the present.
Serenade gave an opportunity not just to uncover the tomb of Nepereth, but also to understand how cultures unaware of previous civilizations are affected by them. Your unnatural interference.
War is natural. Conquest is natural. Revolutionary change is a part of the universe, from evolution to historical epochs. You have become enmeshed in the status quo. A status quo that leaves us trapped in bodies of...
Did you come here to have a debate, Orokin? Shall we raise an overlord as moderator? Or will that merely let you cheat again?
Orokin stopped. collected himself.
The destroyers were a mistake, he said, offering a hand, palm up as if giving the admission as a gift. There, I said it. But I also hold that the destroyers would not have broken into and despoiled the tomb of Nepereth. The orcs will.
You have seen this, I suppose, Trazyn said with a drop of acid. In your... He wobbled his head, made nonsensical symbols with his fingers. Meditations. Orokin traced the scratches across his frame with his fingers.
Mock me, but I have seen it, repeatedly for the last few decades. Not everything I calculate comes to pass, Trazyn, but each time this vision intrudes, it becomes stronger. The war is coming. It will destroy and befoul the greatest cultural relic of our kind, and both of us will be killed.
Trazyn snorted. Preposterous. You couldn't get me to go near that planet. Chasing that damned tomb cost me 2 of my best galleries. Too costly. Sniff after ancient legends, if you like, but leave me...
You're planning to be there when it opens, interrupted Orokin. In 50 years, you've even made site visits. Several, including one last year. I saw you and let you pass unmolested. We have, after all, an informal détente.
Trazyn's mouth opened, closed.
I do not expect Trazyn the Infinite, collector of fine things and rare antiquities, to leave a find of such magnitude unexplored.
Orokin smiled. Trazyn looked down at the Astrarium Mysterios, as if deciding how much trouble it was worth. Set the night side down and kill the engine, he said to the closest lich guard. No sense in wasting reactor life.
I have your attention, then,
Orokin said. The Yith Seer also foresaw the green tide, Trazyn answered, though not in the detail you claim. I had planned to help defend and salvage the tomb, for the sake of posterity, of course.
Of course, said Orokin. But you will die there. The underground tunnels where the tomb resides will, due to the world's unique geology, cut off any translation signal. Necrons killed beneath the surface cannot phase out or, in your case, jump to new host bodies, unless they are in line of sight. Death is annoyingly permanent beneath Serenade.
So, do you have a plan?
Naturally.
Orokin waved a hand, summing a chrysoprase chart showing a swarm of brutish, saw-toothed ships approaching Serenade like a school of carnivorous fish.
The Orc War is destined to arrive in 50 years, roughly 4 months before the opening of the Astrarium. On the whole, they are attacking Serenade because it is there, but they also need its water to cool their ship reactors if they hope to survive warp translation.
Orokin shrugged, as if it were a wonder the Greenskins could puzzle out even that most basic of logistical solutions.
Fight the brutish fungus brains on the ground, and we will fail, he continued. The ships will intervene. Every Zodiac I've cast says so. Fight them in the sky, and we will fail as well. Ground forces already deployed will discover and destroy the tomb. But fight both at once.
Orokin swept 2 fingers up the chart, making 2 prongs of Necron tomb ships. Elegant crescents compared to the lantern-jawed orc craft. Spear into the orc's flank. One broke off and headed for the surface.
A combined space-borne raid on their capital ships, followed by one element securing the tomb against the land forces, will succeed. The orcs will break off, kill their leadership structure, and I suspect the red-eyed savages will withdraw and fight among their captains in order to determine who's in charge.
Thereby diminishing themselves, finished Trazyn. Who is the lucky target? Orokin smiled.
Oh, you like this part. So-called Boss Doc Bigsore, a former medical practitioner of the orcoid variety.
A pain boy? Unusual.
Well, yes, I suppose you would know these things, Orokin said. Apparently he became war boss through quite nasty self-surgery and augmentation. He's also known, I hear, as the Great Sky Soar.
You pronounce Orcish like it tastes bad.
It does, said Orokin. I dislike even hearing myself using contractions, so this gibberish doesn't appeal. But linguistic fibers aside, he smiled, he would make a fascinating specimen. Don't you agree?
I do, said Trazyn, nodding. It will take about 50 years to master a strike force. We're cutting it close.
It will, agreed Orokin. And we are. Once our keel's part atmosphere, we'll have 3 months, if we're fortunate. Most likely 2.
No time to warn the awakened council. They'd bog us down in debate, think it a waste of resources.
Or try to get there before us, said Orokin. I say we keep this one to ourselves.
And with that, mortal enemies mustered for war.